Let's do a quick review of proper message handling when you're doing a public service event or working in an emergency situation. First of all, the messaging we're talking about here is formal messaging versus informal. What do we mean by that? A formal message is one where you integrate a form, typically an ICS-213, with the voice communication of what's on that form. An informal message doesn't use a form. It strictly goes right to voice on the radio, as you often do. You'd use a formal message when you need accuracy in the sending and receiving of the message. It supports accurate forwarding of that message, which may happen beyond your control. It's appropriate for more complex messages, not the really simple ones. And many served agencies will just require you use an ICS-213 to traffic messages because they are very sophisticated in terms of using the overall ICS forms framework. Note that we are still talking about voice here, not digital transmission. However, good habits using an ICS-213 make you a better WinLink operator as well. On the other hand, when you do choose to use an informal voice-only message, it is because it's the fastest way to communicate. That makes it the default for emergency or priority messages where you don't want to or need to stop and compose a form first. You just need to get on the air and get your emergency or priority traffic out there. You may nonetheless follow an emergency or priority broadcast with a formal message to document what you initially got out there. And even when you're doing this informal mode, remember it's push to talk, not push to think. Get your thoughts together for a clear economical message. Let's take a look at some examples where you'd use each of these two modes. A formal message might look like this. It's got some specifics and detail and a given request, and it has a relatively chunky number of words. An informal message where you might not do a form would be something like advising that you can be on duty at your station another hour or so, or, as we mentioned, emergency or priority traffic. So to recap, a formal message does not mean a digital message. It's a voice message that has a form supporting it for better composition, transmission, and tracking. Why do we use an ICS-213? Well, first of all, it's part of the overall ICS framework, which is built on interdependent forms. It meets the expectations you'll find at a sophisticated EOC, where things are tracked and formally logged and brought into the system to make sure they're recognized and executed on where necessary. And it tends to support accurate routing or forwarding to further recipients beyond the one you sent it to. This will be out of your control, but if you put it in a formal message form, it'll more likely be transmitted on accurately as opposed to becoming a game of telephone where the meaning starts to drift. The standard ICS-213 form you've certainly seen. It's a good form. It looks like this. It's pretty self-explanatory, but we find that it's missing a few things in real-world radio operation. For example, it doesn't have a very specific radio-oriented preamble or header. It lacks message identification. There's no field that formally requires you assign an ID number to the message. It doesn't have an indication of message priority, something else you should be transmitting, but this form does not nudge you to assign that. And this basic form lacks a message checksum. That's the idea of counting the number of words in the message and transmitting that so the other party can make sure they received them all by doing a simple mathematic inventory. Now, here in Marin County, we often use a modified, improved ICS-213 that has these features. First of all, here's a place for message number. We'll look at that in a moment in terms of how you compose that, but that makes sure that each message has its own unique ID and is much easier to identify in the future when a reply comes in or someone requests history of that message. Here's a place to set your message priority, either routine, priority, or emergency. And again, it's one more thing that you will transmit when you begin to send this message. It's got some radio-oriented cues when you should break or take a stop to allow the other party to ask you for any repeats or clarifications. And most importantly, in the message body, it has a variety of tools that will allow you to count the number of groups or words, put that into the group count, transmit that with the message, allowing the recipient to make sure that they got the number of words they were supposed to. Now, next up, we're going to complete one of these forms and take a look. But before we do that, let's get our mindset right. First of all, try to get two sets of eyes on a message before you send it. Those sets of eyes would normally be you, the operator who composes it before transmission. but then also trying to get your served agency who wants the message sent to take a quick look at it and make sure you've got it right. Try to keep things very concise. A very rough rule of thumb, 25 words or less. You can communicate a lot with that few words if you edit it down for extreme clarity and compactness. Avoid adjectives and instead try to use facts and numbers. A lot of food is sort of meaningless. 35 meals is much more actionable. And inspect your language for any unintended ambiguity. 2 fire units is a very different meaning than 2 fire units, yet they both sound identical. So here's what a completed message might look like before you send it. Let's go over the process. First, once you've got it filled out, you want to get the attention of your recipient, whether it's a net control or EOC, and let them know you have a routine traffic message and who it's intended for. And this is before you even start to read the message. Then you wait for go with your traffic or go with your message. That indicates the recipient on the other end is ready to start taking it all down because it's a detailed process. When you initially make contact, note that you may be requested to move to a different repeater or simplex frequency to handle this message traffic, as it tends to take some time, and that would tie up the main channel. Then you give the message at writing speed, transmitting so that every word is an event. You want to move at about that pace. And of course, you begin that with the header or preamble. Now, note the message number in the upper left. In this case, we're using one that says TAM13. TAM, let's say, is the tactical call sign for this station that is sending it. And 13 is the 13th message it has sent during this incident. This makes it very clear which message we're talking about in future reference, and it doesn't get mixed up with others by using some kind of generic message number or no message number at all. Across from there, you see you circle the priority to remind yourself to transmit that to the receiving station. Then you give the two, both the name of the person and their position. We do this because the person it's being sent to may be off duty, maybe for some time. But this way, we know the functional recipient. It's the Red Cross team leader. So whoever is in that role at the time, this can be routed to, even if Clark Preston is off shift until tomorrow. Same thing with who is sending it. We have it as Maggie Lang, but we also note that it's Tam High Shelter Manager. That way, in case Maggie's not around to receive the reply, we can route that to the Tam High Shelter Manager on duty. Your subject should be tight and concise like the whole message. Date's pretty self-explanatory. And the time we give in 24-hour format, of course, and you can follow it with the character Lima to indicate local time. When this is done, you wait for a Roger from the other end and any request for fills or repeats of the preamble. After that's done, you move into the body of the message. Now notice here we try to keep it to 5 words per line. That matches with those counts on the end of the line there. You see that column of numbers, 5, 10, 15, 20. Those are enforcing a format where there's no more than 5 words per line. When transmitting this block, you should have a short pause after each line. It's not a full break. It's just a pause in your speaking to allow the other end to catch up in their writing. Also notice we're using the character X-ray to indicate a period. It's a good formatic trick you can use because the word period can have different meanings. X-ray usually is pretty clear. It's a stop. And by the way, you count those X-ray characters as a word. So that first line has 5 words, not 4. And you see our total group or word count is 24. If you look at all 5 of those lines and add them up, and that's the group count number we put right above it. Once you've read this message, again, you wait for the recipient to count up the words against the checksum and either Roger back or request for repeats or fills. A note about numbers. When you're reading these, use the term figures to make it clear that you are enunciating a numeral. For example, you might say, we require 50, that's figures 50, COTS, X-ray. This just makes it clear in the recipient's mind that you've changed gears from words to numbers. Finally, you transmit the signature. It's mostly a confirmation of what was already in the header, and this indicates that you've wrapped the message. You wait for a Roger or any request for repeats, and now the message transmission process is complete. Now let's go to the other station and see what the best practices are for receiving the message that we just mocked up sending. First of all, it's ideal if you have the same blank form that the sender used to compose the message. That's because the fields will line up perfectly. When they give you a message number, You see that on the form. When they go to priority, you are already prepared to circle that. It makes it a lot easier to match field to field. Although if you have different ICS-213s on each end, it's not a fatal error. It just takes a little more overhead and work as you are receiving the message to get everything in the right place. If you're in a noisy environment, focus on one part of the form at a time, and don't be afraid to ask for repeats and fills at those 3 breakpoints that we mentioned when the sender is giving you the information. However, wait for sender breaks, like after they have finished the preamble, as opposed to interrupting them in the middle of the preamble. That becomes messy and you end up with both stations stepping on each other. Now, if you need something resent from the body, for example, know the terms "I need all after" or "I need the word before." These are very useful to make it clear to the sender exactly what you missed. Let's say you didn't get the last line of this message. You would say, "I need all after ETA by." That makes it very clear where you need the pickup. Or if it's just one word you missed, maybe the word "inform" didn't come across on line 4, you might say, "I need the word before ETA." At the end of this message body, then count up the received words, including those periods or x-rays, and compare those to the checksum. If they match, you're in good shape. At that point, you'll close out and say, "I, Roger, your message number," in this case, TAM13, and you're out. A couple of thoughts on receiving a reply to the message we just sent. Here you move down to the bottom of the form, as you can see, and there's a space there to receive the reply. It's important to do that on the same form because that way we can track the request and the action. Make sure the reply you get addresses all of the aspects of the original request that you sent. This is something you do for your served agency to make life easier for them. If they ask for a certain number of cots or tables or chairs at a certain time, you want to make sure the reply addresses all those aspects. Even if it says they cannot be delivered, at least it addresses the aspects of the request. Wait, of course, for sender breaks before you request repeats, the same as we saw on the outgoing side, and then close out again, acknowledging the message number and using out to say you're done. One other thing, when you get a reply and it has to do with substantive issues, you might note it in the activity or communications log, depending on how your station is operating. Let's recap the best practices of messaging. You can always do an informal voice message for emergency, priority, or incidental traffic. But you do a formal message that is supported by an ICS-213 when you've got detailed or formalized traffic that is subject to process and needs a detailed reply. Composing starts with making it clear who it's for and who it's from, including their role, not just their name. A minimum number of words, 25 or fewer, is a good rule of thumb, and maximum clarity. Adjectives are not your friend. Facts and numbers are. And get your served agency to review what you're going to send on their behalf before you send it, if possible. That's 2 sets of eyes on each message. When you do send, speak at writing speed because it's being written down on the other end. Read the top of the message, the preamble, then take a break. Wait for any requests for repeats. Do the same thing for the message body. Do the same thing for the signature at the end. Handle any final repeat requests for the entire message. Verify the checksum. Both parties should say they've received the same number of groups or words. And on the receiving end, record the message on the same form that it was composed on, if possible. Wait for sender breaks before you request repeats, as opposed to barging in any chance you can. And count and verify the checksum of the message. It's one of the fastest ways to make sure you received everything and accurately is to use that checksum between both parties on send and receive. And Roger out with the message number confirmation. As you can imagine, there's no substitute for practice when it comes to message handling. In the composition, the sending, or the receiving, a lot of this comes down to muscle memory as well